welcome everyone to Ahmedabad University and to the conversation series. I'm Sudhir Pandey. I welcome you. Uh, Today we have a very exciting panel, and I would quickly like to introduce our chief guest today, who will be speaking, Professor Payal Arora. She is a digital anthropologist and an author, speaker, and professor. She holds the chair in technology, values, and global media cultures at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. She's also the co-founder of FemLab.co, a feminist future of work initiative. And as we all know, she's the author of a number of award winning books, including The Leisure Commons and more recently, The Next Billion Users with Harvard Press. Uh, Engadget, which is kind of top 100 blogs in the world, stated that her Harvard book is one of the most interesting, thought provoking books on science and technology we can find. And Forbes named her the next billion champion and the right kind of person to reform tech. So we are very happy to have you here. We are excited to have you and welcome to Ahmedabad University.
Thank you so much. Very great to be here.
The person who will be in conversation with Professor Payal Arora is Professor Amit Nanavati from the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. He's also an adjunct professor at IIT Delhi. Prior to this, Amit was a senior technical lead automation solution at IBM GTS Innovation Lab and played the role of senior manager, research staff, and manager member at IBM Research. As a part of IBM Research, Professor Nanavati led the telecom research group on the Spoken Web and SNASI project. Spoken Web project received the National Award in 2009 for technological innovation, best applied research aimed at improving the life of persons with disabilities, given by the President of India. The SNAGI project won an Outstanding Science Accomplishment Research Division Award in 2015, and his 2008 paper, Social Ties and Their Relevance to Churn in Mobile Telecom Network, won the EDBT Test of Times Award in 2018, and he's the right person to have conversation with Professor Payal Arora. Before I hand it over to Professor Nanavati, there are certain rules. So those people who are not joining with their mobile, I would request you to rename yourself. That will be helpful for us to know and to call your name if you ask a question. And in the meanwhile, you can put your questions in the everyone chat box. We'll curate that question and come back to you at the end of the conversation, which is around five or five or 10. So it is all yours, Professor Nanavati.
Thank you very much, Sudhirji. And while once again, thank you so much for making the time. I know you're on a busy trip, so thank you very much for making the time. And you're talking about the next billion users, and I guess I'll start with asking, who are these people? Where are they, and what exactly are they doing?
Yeah, so thanks, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation because normally I'm used to speaking to companies or organizations that have very different conceptions about, the global south, the next billion users. So I'm so used to giving this sort of dumbed down version that I have to elevate my conversation here because much of you already know it, right? I mean, it's around you, you live it. It's very much the fabric. The maids who come in, or the watchman who's holding his phone, or actually the I just came back from, I came to India. I mean, after 3 flight cancellations, in 2.5 years, I made it, and I go to my mom's house, and I see this young kid, right? He's got a snazzy shirt, like he's a delivery boy, but he's dressed to the hilt, like he's gonna go dance with Shah Rukh Khan, and he's got a smartphone in his pocket, he's got his, Bluetooth, and he's armed, and he's cool, and he's ready, And these are aspirational beings. These are, low income but upwardly mobile, aspirationally for sure, right? And they are, hacking it in every way possible to ensure that that aspiration and the reality can be bridged and can, because they're not going to wait for another generation. It's not that they want it now. They're impatient. They don't want a second hand product. They want the full-fledged, in fact, more for less, right? So that's the more elaborate version. But really, the next billion user market, as you all know, is this new generation of millions of people who have come online for the first time. These are newbies, right? So a couple of years ago, and a number of reasons why, right? Phenomenal game changers like Geo that made data plans and extraordinarily cheap. It used to be some of the heaviest and most expensive, and then it's flipped, based on this innovative business models, and of course a variety of reasons we don't need to go into now. But the fact remains that initiatives like Geo enabled access in ways that allow data to be extraordinarily cheap, and people to not just use the internet for utility driven purposes, but allow them like a kid in a candy store. So that's one level, right? The other aspect is that we are in an AI driven economy. It's a data based economy. So suddenly people who have been sort of ignoring the global south are seeing this as a high risk market, right? I mean, it's not worth catering and or even indigenizing or sort of tailoring and customizing products for those markets as if we are the fringe, when actually we are the marginalized majority in that sense. So but now again tables have turned, because just by sheer number, India and China alone dominate the users in the world, and they're not even like optimize that, right? India is like what, 40% or something. I mean of course it all based on how you do the numbers, and China around 50%. But that means there's a huge way to go, and there's so much to saturate. I mean, West is saturated. And then you look at the population decline, right? So the Europeans and the American market is in decline, and generally in terms of demographics, and sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia are the fastest demographic dividend, right? So you combine data, and then you combine these demographic, sort of trends, and it creates this powerful intermingling of business opportunity growth, which is technocentric. But but one of the things already is the next billion users is also, we have to recognize a snazzy term, right? And we have to also recognize not new, because we all know, we've heard of the bottom of the pyramid, the whole Prahalad idea that was in the 1990s, saying that, hey guys, listen, don't be condescending and don't look at this as charity, look at them as a real market opportunity, right? I mean, that was exciting, but then of course it sort of like fizzled, and it was supposed to be a grand failure, and we can talk about that if interested. And then even before that, emerging markets, the term coming from Wall Street actually, because average investor didn't want to invest in developing countries like India. So what better thing than to reframe it, do a new PR, and call it emerging markets? That means it gives you hope. And if only you can get in the first move advantage and invest. And then you need to even narrow it down further for equity markets, and then you call it the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then there's this momentum, right? And then we have to understand before there's the developing countries, with the whole neo-colonial, sort of rubric that was lent to that whole framing. So sadly, while we know there's a legacy of evolution of these terms, we have to, what I have come, to sort of constant interaction with, is that the mindset of the 1940s and 50s is very much alive and prevailing in typical corporate tech circles, typical policymaker circles, and this is something I would love to discuss to disrupt.
Fantastic. So, first thing. So, my first question is: who are these users, not just in India and China, in South Africa and Brazil? How are they? Are they in different? Are they somehow similar? And how do they compare with the first billion users?
Yeah, so I mean, I did a sort of a comparative project between, I had the research teams in Brazil. I did a 3-year research comparative project in Brazil, in multiple cities in Brazil, particularly low-income context, like for the so-called favelas, which are the equivalent of, they're informal settlements, like slums, out here. And so likewise in India, in Mumbai, Delhi, etc. And what the driving goal for the project was just understanding how typically these young people in these low-income settings and contexts use, perceive, and experience digital media in their everyday lives, and particularly what are their notions on privacy, on fulfillment, well-being. What do they get from this, right? In short, and really driving behind it is it going to be dramatically different? So the premise is, if you're from something, a context which is so dramatically different that it's so unrelatable, right, for a typical you and I, who are, let's admit it, privileged in many ways compared to many of the world's population that are below the or at the poverty line. And will their usage be dramatically different? And the quick, answer is no, they're not, because these are aspirational beings just like us. They strive to really use their mobile precious data plans, because often, even though it's become extraordinarily cheap, it's still relatively a luxury good. So they're not doing these they don't have a full subscription plan. They have top ups, they have prepaids, etc. They have dongles, a variety of options, because they often, the typical user is paid on a daily wage. So they can only make a plan of usage on a day by day level, right? So it's a constant precarity they have to live with, but also this constant state of excitement, because they may never leave their village or slum or their favela, but they can become global citizens through the internet. And so, in terms of, you asked a question, in what ways are they similar or different? They're similar in the what we seek for. And by the way, now, I mean, I'm an anthropologist, and so I often, for those who are not, it sounds like a sort of a alien term, is that it's really simply put that we look at the why. Why do people do what they do? And you immerse in the context, the culture, because you can do data scraping, data analytics, which is also, by the way, not even representative, okay? And then you make entire grand plans, which then comes with grand failures. But if you don't understand the why people do what they do, and if you don't understand the humanizing potential that a person in Rwanda, and a person in India have a lot in common for their aspirations for their children, the sort of the binding force, then you will definitely fail in designing inclusive products, services, governance, right? And so I think that's one, and we now have the data to prove it, because if you're a rich kid in the suburb or you're a poor kid in India, you're still using most of your data to chat up, the opposite sex or whatever, or the same sex, basically you are seeking for love and romance. They're teenagers. They're more, the prevailing commonality is that they're teens. That's over and above whether you're from the north or the south, you're rich or poor. And what are teens like? They are self-absorbed. They really want to discover themselves. They need to talk about sex. They have no idea what's going on with their body. They're constantly looking for information, especially in conservative cultures. And, this is happening across board. Even in a rich country, they can't talk to their parents. They have a lot of questions. They go on the internet, So all that sexuality is bonding, and sexuality in the most normalizing way. It's what makes us human, not this, oh my God, the pornography and the perversion of it. So that's the bonding element, right? They are in stages of life. They're in the psychological state of being. They're teenagers. They're the future of our, planet and our society. And that's what binds them together. What differentiates is how they get there, the obstacles they face, the barriers, the social cultural norms, the regulatory regimes, because today we know more so than ever that the internet is not global. What we are experiencing is a increasingly fragmented ecosystem, and we are at a pivotal stage. We'll see to what degree will we have more unity or fragmentation in the future of the internet, right? So
this means that so they are really similar in terms of the maintenance, and but they are different in the terms of the challenges that. And like you just remarked, that even the concept of this has been around, and every time it has failed for somewhat similar reasons, is that a lack of understanding or a presumption that they are somewhat different, right? And now you're saying that, of course, we have a lot of data to show how they are really similar to us. But as a result, do you think the global north is somehow, do you expect it to be somehow better or more sensible in terms of getting these people on board, or?
yeah, so I was talking to a friend of mine. He's a tech guy who typical in the last few years, what's happened in India, like a lot of diasporas in Silicon Valley have come home, right? Aging parents, whatnot, and they've made it out there. They've got top positions. They brought the entire teams here, etc. Right? So he was just telling when we were sharing our stories, because I'm also working, and I'm not going to mention which companies and all, but I'm also working for a big tech company as an advisory, on an advisory role. And I was just saying that, I'm really surprised that, like, it shocks me, because for a technology company that's been around for so long, and especially as we know that number one markets, like on the top 10 countries are the most, Facebook, Twitter, all these. I mean, just check any of the demographics are outside the West. The US, UK are the anomalies. The rest of it is Vietnam, Philippines, Mexico. I mean, Brazil. All of these other countries. So you would think that there'd be a more diversity in a team. So one of the big tech companies I worked with, they actually had almost all old white males. It looked like that team did not change from 30 years because maybe they have like some sort of 10-year-old thing. And it was crazy. I was thinking, well, how are you even functioning like this, right? And then, this other tech company is finally looking at mobile-based applications this year. And I was thinking, did you just miss the boat? And I was wondering, how are they staying in business? Because they have this license model. There's a sort of like they've optimized a market, and this professional services. They're getting their bang of their buck now, but they're not going to last at this rate, and they know it now. It's a wake-up call, a bit too late, I think, because you should not be thinking about mobile design services today. You should have been thinking about it already like a decade ago. So, and I was just sharing these stories, and he's like, he was like, yeah, it's really crazy, because if you're there, and he said, even as an Indian, right? If you're there, he's been there for like 20 years. He said, people don't even question me. They don't see me as an Indian. They just like say, you are competent. You can lead the entire team. The moment he moves to India, everybody's like, but can he handle it? He's like, I was there, right? I'm the same guy. I was there and here. And they start to question competencies. And even the tech company that I'm actually consulting with, one of them is, they have, of course, all of them have branches in India, especially Bangalore, the usual suspect, Gurgaon and all. And they use these teams in the most limited manner possible. They're like back offices still. That's from 2 decades ago. They're not looking at them as experts in a context which is extremely close to them. They are the leads. They should be leading the product design. They should be leading the business plan. No, they are actually, and get this, they are typically examining user practice in the US, users in the US. So they stay up all night, so they can interview users and do experiments, not users here. And so you have to understand, this is old school as it gets. And, but I look at it as an opportunity for Indian entrepreneurs to understand that it may seem like extraordinarily intimidating, because these are deep pockets and these are massive, tech conglomerates that are spread around. But with this kind of mentality and business model, you have far less competition, if you think about it. You just have to pivot in a way that you make them obsolete. And that's the beauty of what and that's how China has been able to rise, right? Obviously, in many ways, not the only way, but clearly they found that these are much more neglected. They decided to look at users. They just decided, without all these preconceived biases, they looked at what users want. How do we cater to these experiences, and they're designing it for them. And India is now actually it's happening now. Before, India was like, happy to be the back offices in many ways, because they were hoping for a trickle down effect, I think. And now I think it's a big change. It is a game changer right now, and I can feel it from all my interactions, and I'm very hopeful about that.
Okay, so you're saying that entrepreneurs in India are already kind of building services for the requirements of the global side? Because one of the I would like to understand it better, because what I see most of the times is that like all the entrepreneurs even here end up building companies that are actually fulfilling the need of the West, because that's where the money funnels from, right? You're always trying to be more relevant to the powers of the markets that will pay you. And so I would like to understand. So So this optimism, or this, not just the optimism, but can you perhaps expand on the examples, or something where people here, when I say here, I mean people in the global south are creating stuff for the global south.
Yeah, I mean, so, yeah, I mean, so one of the things is, of course, like voice-based technologies, right? Obviously, there's no, like, look at podcasting, okay? So it is clearly the case where, there's a huge podcast culture out there, and it's usually typically associated with upper income or middle income to upper income, educated people who are very interested, or commuter cultures. If you tap into the research about podcast cultures in the West, it's commuter culture. So all these with a certain kind of education and economic value, right? And that's completely not relevant in many ways out here. Of course, content-wise, sure, certain content, but it's more important that it makes it accessible because India is such a diversity of languages, dialects, and in fact, India is a perfect test bed for scalability around the world, right? So India is more of a prototype than the US. It is astonishing that we use an American model to replicate around the globe, and people are like, I can understand one's thinking, saying, well, it's worked, hasn't it? I mean, you create in Silicon Valley, you export to the rest, and look, people have gone to that, like whether Facebook, Twitter, all of that. So clearly, you don't need to really customize. We know well what people want, and American values are global values, right? That's the thinking. And you would say that's the evidence of scalability, but we would be sort of naive in thinking that because that's a real distortion of facts. It's all about legitimate choice. Do users around the world have legitimate choice in terms of the languages? Just because they make all that effort to appropriate technologies to make meaning in their everyday lives doesn't mean that's the right technology for them, right? And as we see with what has happened in China, right? When they came up with Chinese applications which worked for them, it was genuinely not a competition. Google was not doing, it's not that Google would have done far better than the local versions of it. It's because it was not keeping pace. Chinese tech companies came up with a payment system which was in combination with a convergence of applications, and it recognized that user experiences has to be a sort of seamlessness where you can also move your profiles, which tech companies don't allow in the US, right? You can't just move your profile because that's your property. And whereas the Chinese, you can actually move it. You also can move within an ecosystem, so you can game and use your gaming. You can also bank, you can date, you can do a lot of it because every click costs data. It could, you could have loss of electricity, you could lose bandwidth. So they make it the least of the hassle, so most of these hiccups can be taken care of, which obviously resonates with typically countries around the world, majority of whom are in the global south, who are struggling to get, especially with the pandemic, right? There's a dedication to connectivity, etc. But it takes time. These are infrastructures that are being built for the future. They're not there fully. So they understood that you need to have products that are flexible, malleable, light, and so like whether you have these like Adobe products versus Canva, right? So it's a design for professions versus for everyday people who want to be creative. So this is what I mean. It's like you're talking about economies of scale which are being respected, understanding that these are not users who have no choice, because when you treat them like people who have no choice, you'll just give them whatever they have to make do, and you have no interest in analyzing them. Whereas, and this is, I think, what's been changing in the last few years, is finally, especially when I came out with my book on the next billion users, it happened to come up at the same time when Spotify set up their, let me see, like when I launched the book, 2 months later, they invited me to open their next billion user lab in, Stockholm. And so that was just 2 months. And then Google also has a next billion lab, and they were just like kickstarting it. They had a very tiny group. And within that year alone, it moved from, say, 30 people to 500 people, okay? So now they wake, and this is 2019. Remember, we have been a market for much longer. So the wake-up culture is happening now. So that's what I mean. Whereas the typical entrepreneur, you're right, the two types of entrepreneurs. One who wants to, still like use the US as a ticket out of wherever, right? And maybe go to the US as a pathway. Can I earn my kind of my pathway out of India to a proper company or whatnot, right? So I can cater to the real market in the West. Or you say, well, you know what? I think there's so much opportunity here. Yes, it's not easy. I mean, having a business here can be a nightmare, right? It's unpredictability in every level possible, but the rewards could be awesome, right? Because there's just extraordinary opportunity. And then there's a sense of like pride that I actually can pioneer something that I can even scale to many other countries, in many parts of Africa. I mean, there's a more of a likelihood that an Indian-based company will do better in Africa than in, a US-based company, if you think right. So, so I think that's the leaning. And so the same thing when going back to my example about podcast cultures, it's looked upon, whether it's in India, in China, as a sort of it's not just about content. It's about building relationships. That's how their podcast cultures are thing. There's live streaming, particularly, by the way, amongst the low income group, which is sort of counterintuitive because that takes more data. But live streaming evokes of more trust, because there's less trust amongst low income populations, so they're willing to pay extra. And this has been evidence we've had for decades. Poor people are willing to pay extra, whether it's hospitals, they're willing to forego free hospitals in India to go to a private inner city, because they're worried that if they go into some hack, they can't afford to like have a bigger illness. Then the only working member will be gone. So they're willing to, it's an investment in the only working member. So that's the counterintuitive thing. They will pay more to get the best, so they can actually, because they want to trust that product, trust that service. And that's an interesting, way to look at it.
So that's an excellent point. So in some ways, China is an excellent example, but it has China just itself from Western influences, whether it's even culture or other things, but to it's like India, for sure. So does this mean that that's going to be? Do you see that as a potential barrier to how much innovation may happen, which time it might take for innovation, as opposed to China? Do you see that as a barrier?
Sorry, Amit, you are going in and out.
Okay. So yeah. So is it clear now?
Yes, much better. Yeah, sorry, because half your question I didn't get because it was in and out.
Yeah. So China, in some sense, has always been good for whatever reasons. It has been good in terms of insulating itself from a lot of things that are Western. Whereas India perhaps has not been good with that. So do you think that could also be a potential barrier?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, China was, look, I mean, India is in all purposes, still a democratic country, and China is more authoritarian. And so they're able to build a solid wall, include the Chinese firewall, and from the very get-go, right? I mean, unlike even Russians who didn't do that, so it's very hard for them to censor now, right? But Chinese already set the entire infrastructure was state-driven, so it's easier. And then not to forget the factory of, hundreds of thousands of people doing manual censoring. So it is a regime of control, but it is a regime of, shall we say, benign authoritarianism, because there's much more paternalism, because they are listening to their people. I mean, more like Putin is more dictatorial, right? He doesn't care shit. But the Chinese are like, I'm interested. So how do we grow these markets? What do we do? How do we cater to them? It's very paternalistic. I don't think this is good for the kids. I mean, look at the fact that they've launched one of the first most comprehensive AI regulations in the world, right? Right in a few weeks ago, I think. And that, however, it is very uncomfortable to think that they should be the drivers of how AI should be governed, especially ethically, right? I mean, these should raise red flags. But actually, what's interesting is that paternalism is not a bad thing, in the sense that Yes, it is not a laissez-faire kind of thing that you just let go and let technology companies do whatever they want. So it's more like, well, I'm sorry, you have a responsibility to children. So it's consumer rights, and they are restraining how gamers, or say platforms are now directly held responsible for the content they produce. So if they are like not actually doing their job of actually moderating it, then they will actually have to pay the price. So it's interesting because this has been the biggest pushback, right, by technology companies. Look at the debacle between Australia and Facebook. Well, Facebook is like, okay, well, we are not a publishing company. We're not held by any code of ethics in that sense. Sorry, we're just neutral intermediaries, which we all know it's not the case. Platforms are political, they're not neutral. They decide to like highlight certain politicians, undermine certain politicians. You've got evidence on that. Certain topics get trended. Why? There's a sort of black boxing, right? We know all the stuff. But what is interesting is Facebook can actually sort of hijack, because a number of public and critical infrastructures of communication, messaging, healthcare, for example, during COVID, is based on these social media platforms. That's to create outreach. So when you tell a country, we're going to leave then, and it goes with Instagram, because Meta owns all these others, Instagram and Facebook Messenger and all. That created a public outcry, and they quickly, reverted, right? But that's no nation wants to be in that position where a company, a corporation can threaten them. So because we have a certain dignity, whether what happened in Nigeria to, it's willing to take a loss to say screw you, because no corporation should be challenging a representative elected government. So I think that's interesting, that despite whatever it is that is coming from China, a number of its governance policies are resonating with many of the global south, saying, we're fed up of this sort of neo-colonial mindset, like, also particularly the market-based sort of corporatized approach to our users, where you don't care a shit, about the well-being of the citizens. You're just looking at us as data points. And I'm sorry, but data is currency, so you need us more than you realize. So we have leverage. So it's a very exciting space we're in today. And I think there's a certain kind of sovereignty, for better or worse, that local governments, nations have in the global south, that they will leverage on today.
Okay, so the other question that comes to mind is, so the global north and the global south have been sort of separated for so long. And on the one hand, some of the needs, based on your studies, what you said, the needs of some of the common people have been similar, but the way these things will evolve as services is again going to be a little bit different, right? So I guess that brings us on to the question of how do we see the relationship between the global north and the global south evolving going forward? I mean, do you think it's going to be kind of the same as it has been, or do you think that there'll be some changes to that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So one of the tech companies I've been working with, their international team literally actually asked me, like, they're like, do you think, I mean, because, they were like this, they're in the US, they're in San Francisco, they're in this woke moment, and they're like, do you think we even have a right to impose our values? It's a very different thing, right? I mean, like, they already, by the way, their business practice mirrors says something completely different. But these are individuals make a company, and they, and it's interesting. So there's just a couple of patterns from my interactions, generally a number of tech companies, because in the last 3 years, I would say I've talked to almost all these major tech companies numerous times, as well as secondary level, like connectivity companies, like mobile telecom companies. And then the third tier, which are companies that wouldn't be obvious, like solar panels, like in Africa, which are combining it with, mobile tech, and insurance companies. So they're trying to do universalizing insurance, or mobile payment, or crypto. So I've gotten into these worlds, and then farming seed companies, global seed companies, which you would say, hang on, what do you have to say about global seed? And I had the same thought. It's like, where do I fit in? They want to reach the farmers, because the future of agriculture will die if people don't see a future in it. And we've already seen the protests happening in India, right? Like the longest protests. And seed companies are really worried because then no farmer wants their kids to take on, and so they want to make it cool. They want to use social media. They want to do they want to create tap into the creator economy, etc., etc. So they're reaching, how do we reach these next billion user market? That's what I'm talking about. So it's really an interesting, there's multiple levels, but coming to it, the themes that I find again and again repeating is well, the global north has no right. So we're in this different consciousness stage. It's like we don't have a right. What do we know? Maybe we shouldn't be developing anything. Okay, but that's rather naive. Like that's like nice to say, but they're doing it anyway, right? Second tier is, are we, how do we have the right to even impose our values? So maybe we should do a little quick sort of user studies rather than talk about, let's empower the local teams in a way that gives them legitimate real power on the same level, right? But there is a sort of fear with that, because if a worker in Silicon Valley is being paid 3 to 5 times more, is being led by an Indian in India, right, in a group on the same technology company, being paid so much less, but leading the group, then why shouldn't the entire division move to India? It doesn't make any market sense. So this is really threatening for a typical designer. The other is that are we, I've designed, I'm a really accomplished designer, technologist, and et cetera, et cetera, but I feel like I'm dumbing down my products because of the templatization or it's just, oh, it's too niche because it's like the sub-regional language, it won't scale. Or it's like a user behavior practice on disability, it won't scale, right? That's because we're looking at it, we're still putting the primacy of identity, like disability as as a core group versus looking at it as a user practice. A good classic example is if you say, I'm going to design, here's my market, people with one arm, okay? How do I design mobile apps for them and usability for, the phone, product design? And they're like, hey, people with one arm, how many people with one arm are on the planet? But what if you picture a user practice of how many times do typically people cannot use both their arms? Driving, mothers who are holding their kids. I'm from the Netherlands right now. I live in the Netherlands, and I have these, people cycling with their babies, their flowers, they're holding a baguette, and they're on their phone, and they're multitasking, and that suddenly it's a game changer. You are actually catering to a disability group, but you have opened up the opportunity to think in terms of an economy of scale based of practice, right? And that's what we need to do, is we need to look at it as, okay, just like low income populations, they needed major battery life because electricity is often not the case. We were in Namibia, we were doing a 3-year project there. Once a week, electricity, like in different parts would come. So it's like one part had electricity one day, the other part. So it's, people even made it a business. You had to pay money to get charged in somebody's house because maybe one house had it. So that's how bad it was. So battery life, there's no way the mobile industry would have scaled in the global south if they didn't take battery life seriously. And that's mainly because of these markets. But everybody's benefited. And look at the future of automation and AVs and solar panels and all that stuff. We all are looking for pioneering much more sustainable, eco-friendly battery life, but that's really the key, isn't it? So I mean, these are just some examples, but I can go on and on, is that then we need to thereby disrupt the global north and south, because the moment we stop thinking in terms of identity groups and we think about how on user practices that are valued, and can thereby be inclusive, we will think differently in a much more sort of solidarity or collective way, right? And that's how we should actually design, right, going forward.
Thanks. So just moving into a slightly different thing. In your book, you've talked about exoticism, right? And that's one of the ways in which the West largely sells its values. So all the people in the global South are also aspiring, right, for things in the global North. And as soon as they think that they might be catching up, then they shift. And this keeps this keeps happening. So that it always is that the global south is always trying to catch up, right? And that's been happening. And so, so my question is that, do you think that that's going to, in some sense, you expect it to change, or I don't know, how is that going to play out as all these forces are going to act and change upon, you know, our entire digital sphere?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the typical mindset is we innovate in the West and trickle down to the rest, right? I mean, that's the sort of mentality. And but the reality is a lot of like look at in my book I talk about a number of innovations like the Arvind Eye Clinic or the Jaipur Foot. I mean, you are looking at extraordinary cost effective, and very important into health interventions which have been pioneered here. And look at what's happening in the US. It's like for the same foot, you'll be spending $15,000 mostly, so pretty much unaffordable. So the wealthiest country will be the most, inequitable, right? Because it doesn't match up. They continue to fight for just the basics of healthcare. So I think something as like our payment systems post COVID, we had a research team also in Bangladesh, and within 2 months the government has came up with their own payment interface, right? 2 months, right? So when there's commitment, same thing with India, right? uh, it radically is changing the fintech industry. But look at the pace, look at the complete different mindset in how fintech can be reorganized. And it's happened in low income countries like India and Bangladesh. So resource constraint, but in fact the resource constraint, when it is not a barrier if there's extraordinary commitment and there's a deep need, urgent need, and there's an enforcement mechanism which is with strong institutions. So I think these kind of disrupt this notion because we need to learn from that, right? And the problem is that the media doesn't give credit where credit is due. So you still have this sort of illusion of innovation still happening in the West, and only often in the West. And it doesn't help when you have, say, people like Carly Fiorina who casually remarked, oh, the Chinese don't innovate, they just imitate our cultures, right? It was so ridiculous from Yahoo. No wonder Yahoo suffered. I mean, like, underestimating your entire, the majority of the world is not a good thing, actually. So, and this, she may have articulated it, which was not a very clever or savvy or diplomatic thing to do, but it's in most of the mindset of people even today is surely they imitate, right? They don't, and that's really not true because you see innovations in everyday life. We're always sort of like making do, especially what we've seen with young people. They will do anything and they come up with the most creative, ingenious ways, whatever you say, the jugaad. We have the term jugaad exists in all of these countries, by the way, in Brazil, and they have their own term. But basically it's saying, there's the rules of the game, which are clearly designed for just an elite, right? A small sliver of the population. If you look at it, whether it's law, whether it's property rights, whether it's, a lot of these regimes, it's almost to keep power where it is supposed to be, which is in the small group of individuals. And, so if you want to play, you can't play the game because it's rigged. So you have to play play with the game, right? You have to play around the game. That's the whole improvisation. You have to hack into it, right? And it's not something that is celebrated like a sort of gamification that is, part of the Western rubric, like, oh, look at this, let's celebrate hacking cultures. No, it's out of necessity, survival. It's about why is cryptocurrency being led by places like Lebanon, Nigeria, Venezuela? Well, because they've worked their ass off, and if they don't do that, they're going to have nothing. Their currency is valueless and the economies are shit. So they have to embrace cryptocurrency. It sounds like high risk to maybe the American market. It's extremely a legitimate choice to someone in Venezuela or Lebanon. So yeah, I mean, so it turns things around, right? So it's really worth keeping that in mind.
Very good. So then, So if you think of things like, let's say, the Jaipur Fort and all these other examples, right? And there are definitely several of them, but there's still a minority, right? And your hope and the thing that you're saying is that somehow all the forces are pointing in a direction where there'll be many more of these, and hopefully that will really start changing things. So I guess then the question comes at what in your mind could be ways by which this could be, this could be bolstered, this could be boosted. So one thing is, of course, that just out of need there'll be entrepreneurs who will think freely and do it. That's one part. But there could be other things as well, maybe policy, or what are all the ways in which you see that this could be somehow, we could help grow this.
Yeah, so or actually, what's really interesting is I think just a few weeks ago, I was invited to be part of the advisory board for an Indian initiative, which is in partnership with Process. So the Indian government is partnering with Process, and it just had its launch 2 days ago, actually. And Process, for those who don't know, is one of the biggest investment tech investment companies in the for emerging markets, right, in the world, right? So they're the ones, I mean, I think significant, like whether it's Flipkart, Mishu, like if you scratch the surface of a lot of the innovations happening in the last few years, it's driven by Process. So the Indian government today is thinking we need to look, and with the COVID, of course, it's a deadly combination of the COVID, unemployment rates, and there's this need to really recognize the creative economy, the digital economy, the ability to pioneer new ways of livelihood, right, which we couldn't possibly imagine, but it's happening. We just have to look at literally on Instagram, on there's an actual, so this is where, by the way, tapping into the poll at the very start, is we seem to put labor against leisure or work against play, but these are classic cases where people, in order to make a living, because they're not going to get a typical job, what they're doing is they're sort of spreading themselves. They're using YouTube, the how to videos, some of the top genre videos, around the world, because people are upskilling, because the education system is not catching up and preparing them for 21st century skills, right? So they're doing that. They're leveraging and monetizing on the attention economy in ways that these are niche markets, like whether it's like the mukbang culture, or whatnot. They're coming up with the ideas that people will pay in a weird way for being entertained, and or to we could crowdsource from total strangers to support a project, because we can do the care, we can build on the economy of care, or there's all kinds of pioneering, but we are not even looking at it. But this is this whole so-called influencer economy. We need to stop using the word influencer and more about the digital creator economy, creator content economy. And that is extraordinarily rich, and it is being monetized, and they are using these sort of like reputational building skills to also create job opportunities in real and material life, right? So because you become a brand, and then companies want to sponsor you, and then you may come up with your own form of shoes, and you come up with your own way of doing things. That's what so that's one of the initiatives the Indian government is looking at. I'll be part of it along with a number of members of Process. And so Process, I guess, from what my thinking is, why the Indian government's looking at them is that, well, they have not looked at India as a high risk market. They've looked at them as a legitimate top market to invest in. They see talent and they see opportunity. So I think that's not condescending, but it's actually, and this collaboration is like, let's make sure we are in alignment with investment as well as citizen well-being and the future of our economy, which really has been battered in the last few years. So that's just one initiative. Of course, data localization practices, or like, well, as I mentioned, about the fintech sort of overhaul in terms of the UTI and all, does make a difference, because it is underlying infrastructure is essential for all sectors, all different. It doesn't matter what your economy is, right? Or what's your profession. So that's like an essential. Whether you are an entertainer, you're a comedian trying to make a living on Instagram, or you're like in an auto and you don't have change, to go off, online, etc., and to bring the unbanked. So that's really essential. And last point I'd like to bring is I saw that like people, there's this notion of entertainment and leisure as something trivial, but actually that's and yet people are most concerned about censorship and governance, right? That was the first poll and then the second. But actually they go hand in hand. In China, the best way of circumventing censorship is through the leisure economy. Like there's something called the cute cat theory. It's a sort of Zuckerman thing that if there's like if you have a sort of a platform, it just basically is so innocuous that you have a lot of cute cats, right? I mean, cats are the number one type of content people love to click on. It's ridiculous, like millions of views on just a cat. But the thing is that it is disarming, and that's where you actually can get attention, but also you can share your thoughts, you can create forums, communities, you can actually have conversation that you otherwise restricted. And the Chinese have become also, because of their extraordinary regime of censorship online, which has been, already in place way before anybody else was doing it. So they are masters of that. You have to understand how citizens have to be extraordinarily creative. So it's often audiovisual because it's very hard to, like it's easier to censor textual material, but audiovisual is vaguer because you're not quite sure if it's satire or if it's really like celebrating the government. You're not quite sure, so you can't actually, and also AI cannot differentiate. So you can't even use AI, so it has to be manual. And that's all happening on so-called leisure-based platforms through entertainment, through gaming. And like shows like Squid Game, it's not entertainment, it's resonates, touching a pulse in people's lives, saying like this whole idea of system and inequality. Entertainment is basically telling a story that really speaks to you, gives you hope. Because if you are mentally devastated, if you're broken down, which of course many of us have gone through so much shit, of course some more than others who are at the front lines, right, from delivery workers, nurses and all, and you feel heard, you feel seen because you empathize with the character on the thing. It gives you courage, it gives you essential coping skills. And this is something we found like dominantly in Namibia, for example, where unemployment amongst the youth in the villages we went to was 60 to 80%. They were having deep depression. And so getting online, being on Facebook, sharing jokes, photos, humor as a very important, made them able to do shit, like they were able to come together. Because we are all human beings, we need that little boost. Where's that coming from? A lecture? I mean, is it going to come from some sort of talk about how to optimize yourself? No, it comes from lightening up, sort of laughing at adversity. And that's something we should really not underestimate. So leisure is not peripheral, it's deep, it's humanizing, it's extraordinarily critical to the way we move forward.
Thanks a lot for that. So in some sense, would I be fair in trying to paraphrase in what you're saying is that you are actually quite optimistic that in some sense that these new billion users have come at a time, and the way all the forces are, it's going to be quite possible for them to actually to have services which are relevant, to not be too dependent on other countries and other forces. And what you're saying is one way or the other, things will move in the right direction. That's am I correct in saying that you're sort of optimistic about that?
Well, look, I mean, firstly, about pessimism versus optimism. Nobody has moved forward with pessimism. Pessimism makes you stand still. Optimism allows you to move forward. So I think we don't have a choice. We have to be optimistic. Okay. Yeah. So optimistic is the only state you should be allowed to be. Otherwise, what you're telling yourself is just give up, just accept. In fact, that's the most cynical way, right? So that being said, is that so I'm always going to be an optimist, because I'm sure every one of you, just the fact that you're participating in this forum, whether you like it or not, are optimists, okay? Because otherwise learning or tapping into what people have to say is pointless. Of what's the point? System's already rigged. Why bother listening to this woman, right? So anyway, so that being said, right, is that yes, it is a pivotal time because data is currency, but that's the whole thing. We can't look at people as data points. We have some serious issues to consider. And I agree with the poll, is like what we have is we're eroding trust if governments do not secure, and we don't have strong consumer rights, strong watchdogs to keep institutions solid, trustworthy. It will backfire. For example, in Brazil with e-commerce, there was such a, like when we were doing research there, there was so much scamming. It was at such a high level that people they went resorted back to cash. Or Mexico, it became a more cash-based economy. It went like this because you have your first experiences. You buy something, it's fake. It doesn't get delivered. You get burnt once, twice, and you give up completely. You may not just give up that app. You may give up e-commerce in general, right? That's not that's a very dangerous precedent. So governments have to take this really, really seriously. Privacy violations. Scamming is now also in India, like it wasn't so bad, but now it's also increasing like crazy. So it's really important. And all kinds of cyber crimes, and that's peaking because of the higher and higher unemployment rates we are facing right now. So you will, the this is also jugad, unfortunately. Crime is part of, well, it is an employment opportunity. Well, I mean, so we have to look at it as, let's give them legitimate jobs by strengthening the digital economy, so we can build actual novel companies and systems and processes to hire these people who actually are pretty skilled. Let's just pivot it to much more useful, socially oriented purposes. Because I think generally people don't want to be criminals. They are pushed to being criminals, right? I mean, because otherwise and also oftentimes most people by default become criminals, because they happen to be in an informal settlement, which is suddenly illegal. So they're not supposed to be there. So, so you're born as a criminal because you're like not supposed, you're already occupying territory that's not yours. So, we need to sort of decriminalize the average user, which is, by the way, the billions of these people, because majority of them actually want to be legitimate consumers, legitimate producers. Let's treat them as such, provide the infrastructures, institutions, so they can be that. And I think then we can be optimists, right?
Absolutely.
So
Thanks a lot for that, Payal. I think there may be other questions here, and we can go to them.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we have been getting some of the questions, and I'd like to invite Professor Jinal Parik.
So, good evening, everyone, and good evening, ma'am. It was a pleasure listening to you. And my question, as I have put it here for everybody in the chat, is very simple. What inspired you to write this book and about this topic? Again, more specifically, I have written what was that one trigger point that made you write about this?
thank you, Janelle, and I appreciate it. It's a good question. Actually, I remember what was my trigger was when I was my first project actually in Kuppam. So I was in my 20s, and I was serving as a liaison. I just finished my master's, and I was serving as a liaison between World Bank, Hewlett Packard, Planet Reed, a whole bunch of organizations in Kuppam, because Chandrababu Naidu, the then CEO of Andhra, was ready to make his constituency, the I community, like everything digital, right? The NASDAQ 24/7, all that stuff. So I was supposed to be the in between person. So I went there. I was living there for 1 year, which was very exciting for me because I'm from a Bangalore city girl. So, as if I represent all of India. Clearly, I don't. So it was really humbling and exciting to be in an area which was more representative. And when I was there, what we realized is we created all these, snazzy things. The whole premise of all these, we had ATMs for information, so kids could like just learn English and all sorts of software programs. We had NASDAQs, and all community centers would like drop down with information. It was very information centric, knowledge centric. All this idea that it could uplift for socioeconomic mobility. But within months, we used to have these mobile vans, we call them, which is sort of like ridiculous, like redundant. But anyway, it was literally called the mobile vans. And it would move village to village in Andhras, and basically to teach farmers how to, understand about crop prices, etc. And before you know it, the mobile vans were called, TV vans, no, movie vans, because they try to hook them with a movie, like of Tollywood. And people thought it was, oh, free movie. So they would all dress up, the whole family would come. As soon as the education program started, off they gone, and they like use it as an intermission, right? Or the ATMs of information became gaming stations. Kids were just gaming all the time, right? And I was thinking, rather than being frustrated about this, we have to also understand that leisure internet is their leisure economy, often their prime leisure economy, because they're isolated, they don't have that many options. It can be very repetitive and routine as a farmer or in a village, etc. No wonder these are human beings who need to feel like, so they have conversation to have, they bonding. You can have a family arguing about some soap opera, a movie. It became something, it architected their life, which was not monotonous. And by the way, that's usually a pathway into other kinds of skills which are transferable, because then you learn how to use the internet. You it sustains you on the internet to discover more. So we shouldn't panic about it, which usually, and that's really got me hooked, because initially I was also panicky. I'm like, oh shit, what do I write in the report, to Hewlett Packard and all? Is this a total failure? Was it a failure? So it got me really thinking, in the back of my head. And then over 2 decades of research in India, South Africa, Namibia, the same thing kept happening again and again. And I thought, there's something obviously wrong. And that's when I wrote the book as bringing it all together. So yeah, so that's a very long answer. I'm sorry, but
No, but that was very interesting to hear. Thank you so much for
of
sharing the
course.
thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Mubarak Ali. He has a host of questions. So Mubarak, if you can switch on your camera and ask your question.
Good evening and good morning to all. First of all, my internet connectivity is very low and poor, sir, so I couldn't able to turn on my camera. Sorry for that.
Yeah, no problem.
That's no problem.
Respected professor, thanks for your invaluable insights. I'm looking forward to read your book and extending my sincere thanks to organizer for this opportunity. My question: how Agile will drive the Internet of Behavior in 2022 and behind? And my second question: what's the most important takeaway you want people to remember after reading this book? Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Could you repeat the first question? I got
Yeah,
the second question.
I'll repeat it.
Oh,
because
okay, okay, good, good.
So he's asking that uh, the internet is evolving and why we should care. And second one is how agile will drive the internet of behavior (IOB) in 2022 and beyond.
Okay, no, and thank you for these questions. I really appreciate you taking the time. And so, one is that, like you said, what's the takeaway, right? The takeaway definitely is that the global poor, for want of a better term, or the next billion user market, are people who are full-fledged, human beings who are aspirational users, and they will be non-utilitarian. So because most products and services are designed in a sort of a utility driven purpose. And there's a double standard to this. For example, concretely, if you look at healthcare, right? Do you know self-care apps are the number one nature of healthcare apps in the West? Self-care apps are really top in the market. But when you ask technology companies, so I was hired to do a consultancy for them, they started to think about fertility control content for the global south, in Africa, in all these. And I asked them, I said, why? Okay, you have the data about self-care, so why do you imagine it being so radically different that they only need fertility control? It's because of it comes from a legacy of development practice and how they see global south as, bodies to be controlled, the whole population bomb, the whole, so it's a very, you don't see the populations as typical users who actually have needs for care. So it's all about very restrictive ways in which you're interpreting health. But actually, the reality we found was the typical users are young and they have all sorts of questions which are taboo about menstruation, body hair. Well, the typical question a teenager asks is, am I normal? Right? And so they are resorting in that self-care, or they want to feel fit and good looking, and they want to be on Instagram, and they want to see what diets to have. And we're talking about and I'll give you an illustration. When I went to Almora for my first book, I was there for a year and a half, and I thought I should dress down or something. So I just went to, Sarvajina Naidu, whatever. I just got some crap and wore it, and some salwar kameez. And then the girls in the village said, "Oh my God, you're so old-fashioned. We really need you to go to a tailor and become hip," because they were like watching YouTube videos, and they were on top of the fashions of Delhi, etc. And they were getting tailored, and they were kind of embarrassed to be with me. And I was like, oh my God, I was really condescending. So, I mean, long story short, is we need to treat them respectfully as genuine, complex users, as typical users, right? So we need to look at them as not, oh, low income as a normal, typical defining aspect, but rather that they're teenagers or they're, and of course they're resource constrained, but, a variety of things. And let's not just profile and create a reductivistic perspective, because we'll never really cater to them, right? And, and then that actually is tied to your other questions about, for it to happen, we have to be agile, flexible, because their lives are them precarious. That's the single most defining feature of majority of the population, precarity, which means they can't predict what happens tomorrow, whether it's in terms of money, whether their school will be open, whether it's like, will they have food? They don't know anything. But you know what's the single most, or more connectivity, right? But one of the things they do know is that if they invest in their profile, whatever, they are building home online. It is their anchor as they move around in their auto rickshaw drivers, or they're in Dubai leaving their families behind, like, hundreds of thousands of Bangladeshi men won't see, or in Almora, most of the guys were in Delhi coming once a year to see the women, their families. So, I mean, this is what I mean, is the rootedness of the internet. Let's not underestimate. So that will allow us to respect that how in time, even though they're precarious, they need stable structures, and we can provide that with holistic, trustworthy digital systems.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Professor Vivek Tanawade to ask his question.
So very interesting conversation. And my question was, how does content of the internet change as a result of the next billion users coming in? And an example that comes to mind is, if I looked at YouTube videos 15 years ago, it was very difficult to find anything in Hindi especially for highly specialized niche areas like, let's say, high-end audio systems or cars. And today, this is no longer the case. So pretty much even so-called more expensive items are very niche areas have videos in Hindi and other languages. And so does this then, so YouTube, of course, is community driven, and this is the community is there because there's a demand, and the demand is coming from countries, from people who don't necessarily understand English. But then the question that comes to mind is it the same for technology companies or companies in general, where when they develop such tools to reach out to their markets, now they need to be aware of the fact that it is not only the English-speaking developed world of the West that needs access to these tools, but it's a much wider audience.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Actually, it's also very timely. So thanks, Vivek. Because I'm actually I'm doing a digital creativity project in India, in Hyderabad, Delhi, and Bangalore. And basically, the notion driving, and I'm working with another tech company about this, is about what is typically the creative economy look like in India. And India is representative for other, replicable for other global South nations. So it's an entry point to the global South, because if you can pioneer for India because of its diversity of culture and social linguistic opportunities, then you can actually be more flexible elsewhere, right? And what we're finding, like for example, share chat. I mean, you go into share chat, there's numerous language options, right? And dialects. And it is really changing the way in which communication is happening in the local languages. And so there is a significant shift. And also because data used to be so expensive, of course, people were being represented. So low income populations, which are the majority of the world still, but again, upwardly mobile, right? are have long been represented by people in typical television, radio, whatever. We have thoughts, we frame them, right? Now they're directly framing themselves in ways they want to be seen and heard, right? Because of, how cheap data has become, how they are, when TikTok wasn't banned, I mean, the whole sort of village influencer culture exploded, right? Because it was seamless, and we got to see life in many different, from villages in Africa to, and there was a sort of resonance. And what was interesting was a massive disruption, that local content does not mean local audience. That's a major finding. I mean, Squid Game is a case in point. People are like, nobody's going to read subtitles. That's a niche thing. That's foreign movies. No, it did so well, right? I mean, this is really disrupting the way, and that means it's all about the story. Is does that story give resonance? It's about digital storytelling. And if you can, touch into, the lack of representation, or the sort of, if you look at the lack of diversity of stories, from Hollywood, even Bollywood, there's certain kind of tropes that keep getting repeated again and again. No wonder people are spending more and more time on digital media like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, because they want a different story which resonates with them. And finally, because it's not there, they're just creating it on their own, right? So we are finding the whole nature, like for example, we're finding a much blink culture, right? And so it's interesting how platforms got nervous. So TikTok got really nervous, right? Because they were like, oh my God, we don't want the stigmatization of TikTok culture becoming a low class, because a lot of low income populations are getting on it, which actually, by the way, wasn't coming from a market analysis of upper class, in general. Because of the algorithm, people were just curious and interested, and, were just actually astonished, because they always expect some sort of poverty porn of misery and kids with their ribs sticking out, and they're like, hang on, that's really defying my thinking. So I think there's so much excitement in the nature of content, particularly because the storytellers are finally themselves. They're not filtered through all these interpretation, beautiful, historical legacies of nostalgia that middle class Indians have of, like, of the past, right? So I think that will allow us for a more honest future, right?
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Professor Bijal Mehta to ask a question.
Hello, Payal.
Hi.
It was wonderful listening to this very interesting conversation. So thank you to both of you for taking it forward so well, and very, very informative. So many diverse viewpoints. I particularly was curious to know your views on the emerging sharing economy practices. We have the Ola and the Uber drivers using the internet. On the other side, we also have, for example, the accommodation services, which now with the accommodation is not being limited just to the hotels. We have homes and we have the homestays where they may not have as much exposure to the internet per se, but it has actually given a lot of opportunities on the face of it. But from the little that I have read, both from the Indian scenario as well as international, there might be some dark sides to it as well. So maybe your thoughts on both the aspects, from the perspective of the drivers and the homeowners than the consumers, because for us definitely it's beneficial, but what about them?
Yeah, so I'm just putting my lab, FemLab, on the chat. So basically, actually, this is exactly what we've been doing in the last 2.5 years. We've been looking at how workers, particularly women workers, have been using the gig platforms like Urban Company, Ola, Uber. So Etsy India, like, so all these differences, 6 different sectors we are focused on: the garment industry, the in Bangladesh, artisanal sector, salon services, like you said, sanitation, construction, so a variety, right? And what we
Right.
found was really interesting over the course, especially the pandemic made it really sort of raw and very urgent, because there
Hmm.
was sort of a real gap. So let's just say, like, let's take one thing, right? Is the ride hailing sector. There's so much emphasis on the customer side, right? But
Absolutely.
the customers, so you have a question mark, is there's half the population are women, right? And mobility and women have always been a sort of fraught sort of tension, because in many patriarchal cultures, it's not easy to just move seamlessly, right? So that is part of, and India, for whatever is said and done, is a patriarchal culture in many ways, right? So where women move, at what time are they moving, who are they with, what are they wearing, all the sort of public visibility and movement makes a difference. Now then you're like, well, but they do need to move if you're working, right? You have to be out there. So rather than wonder why they're not there, we basically pivoted to the drivers. Why aren't there enough female drivers? There's barely any. So we started to look into it, and we've been working with Ola, Uber, and all these guys, and Ishram and all. And part of it is because if you have women, so is it women for women? Because maybe you can't change culture overnight, right? Because fathers will, I mean, because there's a legitimate concern, because it's sort of a catch-22, right? It's like the more you hear these horror stories, you get worried about your kids going out and all that stuff. I mean, your girls, right? And or your wives or not. So so the idea is that the if you can recruit women and you can hire them for your family, but then we realize actually a lot of people, it's not just for women, it's for older people, because women are much more patient with older people. So the sorry, hopefully not COVID. Okay, I shouldn't joke about that. Anyway, so so elderly populations, we notice that it's more than just women for women. Also, like you're still catering to the family as a unit, because in the end, even if it's for women, the husband or the brother may book it for them. So so you can't be, so we all these things. So then how do you prove on the other side it's a woman? So these little boring details makes it different. And one of the weird reasons, when we talk to so many women drivers or women drivers who quit in this sector, and we ask them why, and one of the dominant thing was lack of toilets, because they couldn't go to a toilet, and women need to use toilets for a variety of things, right? Our bodies are different. We need to stop far more. We have menstruation, we have other things. So it's an equity aspect. And they say these rest stops are not for generic drivers, it's for men. It's inappropriate. So they can't. So that's the main reason they quit. So that's fixable. Now we can, we have a legitimate intervention, which is, where we can, and it has to be visible on the design of the algorithmic system, and the company needs to take into account for it in terms of their ratings and their decline aspects, or the gap between it. So all these things can shift algorithmic infrastructures, business models, government plans of infrastructure, all based on one thing, which can boost mobility. And that's just one example.
It's really
Thank you so much.
interesting. Would
So
this be available somewhere to read?
Oh yeah, so please check I just share the website, FemLab. We actually have a symposium in April,
yeah.
where actually one of the segments you may be particularly interested in, because we bring a variety of people from the ride-hailing sector together. The actual the CEO of the taxi, and a variety, like a driver herself. So we're trying to do a pit from a top to micro to macro. So check the program. Maybe you'd be
Sure.
interested.
Yeah, I
Thank
had
you so
already
much.
shared,
Thanks,
and I'll share
Great,
that
thank you.
link again.
Thank you.
Now I would like to invite Professor Kaushik Jannah to ask his question.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Payal. It's such an interesting conversation, and you covered many things. My question here is that, yes, it is clearly visible what kind of potential opportunity do we have because of the internet, especially for the South. But there is an inequality of representation of people through the internet in North and South. Like, in your observation and in your study, can you give us an idea, like what are the differences? Means, in the real society and population, we have this proportion of older population, this portion of this percentage of women, this percentage of youth. Then how this reflected in the internet usage and digital presentation, both in North and both in South, in North and South, and then like their difference.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's, you're tapping into one of the most crucial conversations happening in, in policy circles, as well as like a variety of different tech companies. For example, I'm going to be part of a major project. We just got awarded a grant on recruitment AI and anti-discrimination, structuring into recruitment AI technologies, right? Because now the way HR works is a lot of it is becoming AI driven, right? You upload your videos because you get all these CVs, like hundreds of thousands, whatever. How does this, a system is able to sieve through it and recommend and reduce it to the actual HR personnel? But what are their criteria, right? And there's this whole conversation of, well, you can't discriminate because, if the system is learning from past CVs, as the Amazon debacle about its recruitment system, where it recommended mainly male white CEOs because the past CVs were mainly white male. So it learned that that's a typical CEO that you should look for. And by the way, that's just an example of any kind of AI based systems. Is what are we building it on is past bias, because for a variety of reasons, certain tribes couldn't go, certain castes couldn't enter, certain women, like gender, etc., which means that the past is obviously skewed, and yet we are building entire future based systems based on the data of the past, which we are teaching these technologies to learn from. So it's a genuine conundrum. And going specifically to your question, one of the challenges is, for a technology company, they're not interested, they never are interested in individuals. They're interested in people like you. It's always a cluster. The question is, how do you create that cluster, especially with the conversation on intersectionality? Because a Black woman in the US is different from just a woman. Okay, so it comes from a different kind of user practice, different kind of politic. So and then you put class, right? So that's the whole notion of intersectionality. Class, Black woman, you're going to create a very different kind of participation, analysis, right? And the same thing with India or anywhere actually in the world. But the thing is, that's identity. And then as I brought up earlier in the talk about process or practice, that regardless of whether you're a Black woman from a lower class or if you're a upper Brahmin woman from India, you may have similar kinds of needs and aspirations and goals, right? So I think this, the clustering of different people and the versatility of the clustering, it's going to be one of the most challenging aspects. How do we make it responsive, mobile, and not frozen in the past, especially because we want to build a better future, right? We don't want to repeat our past. And we can't be forced to repeating. We surely can come up with a better way. But so this is honestly what we are currently struggling with. So we are going to start the project in October with Algorithm Watch, Praxis, and some really very, like, it's a bunch of European groups, but we are going to scale it globally too. But it's a confounding and an important work. And we are building we have an interdisciplinary team of, computational scientists to people like myself and anthropologists who are in user practice to a variety of things. So let's see, legal, and I think that's the only way to go. We have to put our heads together and bring a diversity of skill sets and worldviews, because that's the only way we can tackle one of the most formidable problems. Let's not repeat the past, basically.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And also, like, just to add up a point here is that even the government of India, so they understand the high volume of data we have through the technology and the company, but then they are trying to override these these data, and they are not using the main representative data that physically the government actually collect. So they want to replace that mechanism with this technology. But these can also follow face the same kind of risk of not representative, right? So
and absolutely, because it's how much of it is an extension or reproduction. And in fact, it's not just a reproduction, it's an amplification of that reproduction, because it has a network effect that typical surveys, for example, don't have, because it intersects with other data sets which can have implications not just on, say, data on education, but data on healthcare, and et cetera, et cetera. So it has more devastating possible consequences or enabling, right? The way you slice your pie, basically. But yeah, good point.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of more questions, but I know that as you requested initially, you have to leave at 5:30. So I would like to hand it over to Professor Nanavati to close the session.
Well, thank you so much, Payal. Really sparing the time and sharing your thoughts. I would just like to say, this sort of that it seems like the next billion users are here, and they are repurposing and redefining the internet. They are disrupting it, and perhaps we can ignore them at our risk. And as practitioners, we cannot afford to be complacent, right? And if I think I understood Payal correctly, that this is for us a great opportunity and a great responsibility as well. I mean, if we are the privileged ones, and yet we have so much of the context because we are living where we are, then it's really up to us to sort of be very sensitive to the needs of this population whom we understand so well, and perhaps facilitate their entry, and perhaps welcome them, be sensitive to them, and do enough for them, so that we ourselves are also not sidelined in the process. To be relevant, to stay relevant. Thank you so much again, Payal. It's really been a treat talking to you, and thank you so much for making the time.
And thank you. You put it brilliantly. So I appreciate the summary. You hit the nail on the head. So thank you everyone for also making the time. I know it's Saturday, and so it's technically the beginning of your rest. So have some leisure. Okay.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure we are very keen to have you on campus soon. So we'll follow it up. Thank you so much everyone for joining.
Bye.
And take care.